Good evening. Welcome to the Special Committee of Whole meeting today on Monday, July 13th. I'm Councillor Lorraine Allen, and I'll be chairing the meeting this evening. I'm going to start by taking the attendance of my fellow councillors. Mayor Panko will be here shortly, not here right now. Moving on from him, Councillor Alford.
Present.
Councillor Brennan.
Present.
Councillor Dwyer.
Present.
Councillor McGuire.
Present.
And Councillor McKenna.
Present.
Sarah Morris, would you like to do the attendance of staff that are here? I can't see.
Yes, certainly. So we have Director Manhire with us, Director Dunlop, Manager of Economic Development and Tourism, Jennifer Miller, Deputy Clerk Nadine Bennett, Treasurer Janet Kuziel, and Senior Planner Carl Grenke.
Great, thank you. Are there any amendments to the agenda? Any disclosure of monetary interest? Okay, not seeing none. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce to us Caitlin Morford, planner from JL Richards, and she's going to talk to us this afternoon about Smith Falls Downtown Core Parking Study. Welcome, Caitlin.
Welcome. Thank you, Madam Chair, for having me. I also have Tim Chatter with me from JL Richards as well. He's here just to help assist with any of the questions that may arise at the end of my presentation.
Thank you.
I'm hoping if you just want me to jump right into it, or
yes, go ahead.
Perfect. So I'm hoping to keep it fairly high level. There's a lot of information in the report that I understand you were circulated. And I'm just going to kind of go through the overall recommendations of that report. I guess we're individually looking at the slides of the report, or how are we undertaking that?
Our IT.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah,
perfect.
To display them.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Sounds good. Oh, I'm just trying to make it a little bit smaller on my screen. There we go. So will I just let you know when I would like the slide to be changed?
Yes, that's good, Katie.
Okay, sounds good. First and foremost, JL Richards was hired by the town to undertake a parking study focused on the downtown core. The objectives of this study were to review the existing town's data, consult with town staff and applicable stakeholders to assess parking provisions in the current zoning bylaw, and propose, in addition to that, propose an appropriate cash in lieu of parking strategy, evaluate the town's parking management system, assess future parking requirements in response to anticipated development and growth, identify accessible parking opportunities in accordance with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and to prepare a report on project findings and a viable local-based solutions for consideration by the town and council. Next slide, please. So this image represents the boundary that was subject to this review. The major defining boundary features include Milne Street to the north, the Rideau River to the south, Elmsley Street to the east, as well as Old Mill Road and George Street to the west. Next slide. As part of this report, we reviewed 10 reports, plans, and guidelines as part of the background documentation. The analysis within this report is also based on the parking data collected in the 2018 parking utilization study. Next slide. As part of the scope of this work, we held 2 community engagement sessions in order to identify issues within parking in the downtown core, and to present our preliminary findings and recommendations. We also reached out to the Downtown Business Association to obtain their input. Next slide. These sessions really didn't provide any clear consensus on any perceived issues or possible recommendations, But some of the comments we received included the fact a perceived lack of key parking and wayfinding information, difficulty finding close parking to certain businesses, primarily issues finding parking on Beckwith and Chambers Street, difficulty finding accessible parking within the core. They mentioned a desire to encourage cycling and walking and encourage shared parking. There was a note about the need to replace parking meters to include different cashless options. And then some mentioned that duration limits for parking should be enforced to encourage further turnover. Some wanted to maintain paid parking to encourage turnover. Others want to eliminate paid parking to encourage visitors to the area and to visit businesses. Most were not willing to pay more for parking within the downtown core. Next slide, please. As part of our case study research, we looked at 3 different communities within Ontario that had recently undertaken a similar parking study. It should be noted that all of these communities did not identify any issues with parking supply during their peak demands. As such, no additional parking facilities were required to accommodate future growth in these communities. What these reports did was provide enhancement opportunities to better manage the parking regime within their study areas. Next slide. Some of these municipal enhancement tools that these communities utilized included wayfinding signage and other signs that could help to identify municipal and private operated parking lots, directional signage, parking information signs showing use hours of use, parking restrictions, that sort of thing. Allocated areas. Within allocated parking spaces, a portion of the parking supply could be dedicated to longer term parking needs, such as employees and residents living within the area. This is typically accommodated by parking information signs and the use of a permit system. Transportation demand management, having a focus on improved cycling in the walking environment to reduce pressure on the parking system. Shared parking refers to the available parking spaces that can be shared by more than one user, given that several users may be away at any particular time. Example, employees not at work. Shared parking spaces typically allows for 20 to 40% more users when compared to assigning each space to an individual user. Parking pricing schemes, the intent of the parking fee set by location is to optimize turnover of prime on-street parking while redistributing demand to underutilized areas. And additional parking resources, which can take many forms. This can include adding to the parking supply to accommodate demand from future growth, utilizing web-based applications to help users identify location, price, and availability of on-street parking, updating pay-for-parking infrastructure, such as meters, and increasing parking enforcement to deal more efficiently with parking violations. Next slide, please. Going just briefly into a little bit more detail about each of these municipalities we looked at. They didn't all utilize every single one of these enhancement tools. This was kind of a table that showed which ones utilized which tools. Wayfinding signage, for example, was utilized in all 3 communities, as well as the continuance of monitoring of trigger points for when additional parking resources would be required. In this example, the only community, the city of, or the town of Orangeville, had proposed higher on-street parking and lower off-street parking, and to incentivize people to use off-street parking resources more. It should be noted that after this report was done, the town of Orangeville had decided to remove all paid parking within their downtown core. Next slide. So going a little bit more into detail of the shared parking tool, for a mixed use commercial services business on the same or on separate lots, but they share a parking area, this is a tool where you would calculate the parking requirements for each specific use in that project. And the parking requirement for each use is then multiplied by the percentage of the peak period during the weekday and weekend. And essentially the highest figure from all those time periods becomes the required parking for the project. So in this scenario here, you have 3 users, an office, a theater, and a hotel. Each together would require 114 spaces. But if you look at how many are actually used during the peak periods of morning, noon, and afternoon and evening, they really only need 104 spaces on average. So that's for weekday versus weekend. So in that case, you'd go with 104 spaces versus 114. It just takes a little bit of the load off of some of these users that don't necessarily have, or some of these businesses that don't have users using their parking lots all the time. Next slide. So as part of some additional supplemental case research, we looked at a few other communities in terms of mainly four specific items: parking rates and time restrictions, cash in lieu of parking fees, enforcement fines, and parking space dimensions. In terms of parking rates and time restrictions, most of these downtowns that we reviewed offered free on-street parking for a 2 or 3 hour window. Some municipalities offered free off-street parking as an alternative. The city of Kingston, for example, is an exception where they implemented pay and display parking meters throughout their entire downtown core. But they do offer free residential or free parking on most residential side streets in the central area. Most communities reviewed did not provide for accessible on-street parking spaces. The city of Kingston, again, another example where they did have on-street accessible parking spaces provided, although they were not sized in any way different from a typical parking space. They were just identified as accessible. It's also important to note that all the municipalities reviewed rely on the use of higher enforcement penalties and charges such as cash in lieu of parkland to offset the total loss in parking revenue. In terms of cash in lieu of parkland fees, they vary from municipality to municipality. While some smaller municipalities have rates very comparable to the town of Smith Falls, some larger municipalities have very high rates starting in a few $1,000s. Other municipalities use a method based on land costs and then divide that by the number of anticipated spaces to determine the value of each space. A couple of these municipalities do not have cash in lieu rates. Instead, they utilize a parking levy tax based on the current land value assessment to generate revenue. None of the municipalities we looked at anticipate or allow for the use of required parking spaces for the establishment of seasonal patios. However, most of them did exclude these areas from their required parking space calculations within their zoning bylaws. In terms of enforcement, the typical cost of a common parking infraction for most of these municipalities is somewhere between $20 to $40. Major infractions can be a few $100s in some cases. And in terms of parking space dimensions, they vary in terms of sizes for regular on-street spaces, such that it's difficult to find any real trends other than most municipalities are going to parking spaces that are not specifically delineated in size. It's just an area from one end of the block to the other, stopping for hydrants and driveways and any other impediments. So an area for cars to just park between. Next slide. So this is just a little bit of information that was also presented at some of the, actually 2 of the workshops we held with the public. This just identifies, first and foremost, the image is one that was given to us by the town that identifies generally the parking and the rates associated with the parking in the downtown core for on-street and municipal off-street or private public parking lots in the downtown core, as well as a small table that deals with parking space revenues between the year 2014 and 2018. As you can note, they've been going down over those years. This is due to a number of factors, including the fact that a lot of the meters within the downtown core are either no longer functional, or they have been removed or been stolen. They just are not charging parking for those specific spaces anymore. Next slide. So based on the parking utilization study, which formed the data basis for our analysis, the downtown does not reach a threshold for requiring additional parking resources in the downtown. Based on this, the highest peak of vehicles within the downtown is weekday off-street, which reaches about 51% capacity. On-street reaches 45% for weekday. It's generally assumed to be that 85% is the trigger for practical capacity or requiring additional parking resources to support the existing infrastructure. Next slide. So this is just a little bit more detail on that. Essentially, the town is currently booming. There is no major redevelopment projects pending within the core that do not provide their own on-site parking. And the future will be a mix between boom and bust years. Based on the official plan, the growth projections in your current official plan, there is no scenario in which the town would require additional parking resources within the downtown core over the next 20 years, even at a high rate of growth based on the OP. Next slide. So again, this is just a visual representation of reserve parking capacity during peak periods. At the top, we have weekday, on-street and off-street. And at the bottom, we have weekend, on-street and off-street. And you can notice that there is still a large reserve capacity available during peak periods. Next slide. So as part of our report, we provided different tools or recommendations on tools that the town could utilize to help enhance and support the existing parking supply, despite the fact that the data does not identify an issue with lack of parking within the core. So I'm just going to go through the recommendations for each of these enhancement tools. Next slide. So the first one is improved wayfinding and enhanced signage. It can help residents and visitors acclimatize to their surroundings, provides visual clues and easy recognized symbols. You would install them at key points of egress and major intersections to assist in identifying available off-street parking lots. On-street parking information signs that provide key information such as time periods, rates, where they can pay, that sort of thing. And maps and other printed materials and online resources such as mobile parking applications can be developed and utilized as well. Next slide. Parallel parking space dimension. It should be noted that the zoning bylaw does not apply to streets. Zoning bylaw applies only to private properties. The current dimensions for angled and parallel parking spaces in the zoning bylaw, which apply to private lots, are typically slightly larger than the other communities we reviewed, but they're still suitable for spaces located within parking lots. Our recommendation is on-street parking lots should not be individually demarcated, but just the outer bounds be identified from driveway to hydrant and end of block to end of block, that sort of thing. On-street parallel accessible spaces, if provided, should still be formally identified on the street to specifically delineate their boundaries. Next slide. Improve accessible parking. The AODA does not provide standards for on-street parking spaces. They only provide guidance and direction for parking within lots. Though they do apply to all development in Ontario currently as part of a building permit applicable law, the town could look at developing or incorporating those AODA standards in an update to your comprehensive zoning bylaw. Again, it would be based on the AODA standards and further supported by public consultation with residents and other stakeholders. Staff should also prioritize the provision of accessible parking spaces through new developments where possible. And although specific land uses do not trigger additional accessible parking requirements in the AODA, so example, a theater is not required to provide more additional accessible parking spaces versus a retirement home. They only go based on, or they only provide guidance based on the number of number of spaces within a lot. The town could add a further mechanism to your zoning bylaw to require additional accessible spaces at the discretion of staff based on specific uses. Next slide. Accessible parking deficiencies in the areas of the core could also be addressed by the town providing on-street accessible parking spaces if they wish to do so. In order to do this, the town could develop a guideline based on a modified AODA or AODA standard for a block by block or lot by lot basis within the study area. So in this case, we looked at each block as if it was its own parking lot in order to determine how many additional parking spaces under the AODA guideline would it trigger. Next slide. Again, using this block by block analysis, accessible spaces could be located at the first or the last space on a block to face, on the block face, to provide egress and ingress from a space, ideally where you already have curb cuts, where you already have a potential access up onto the sidewalk. And again, we provide a figure in the report that shows possible locations for existing and potential accessible spaces. Again, note that due to engineering constraints, site constraints, some of these locations may not be feasible. It would really come down to an individual analysis of each spot and where it makes the most sense. We also recommend possibility of accommodating an access aisle behind the accessible space for vehicle loading. Next slide. The next recommendation was prepare bicycle parking standards. Improvements to walkability and cycling infrastructure along Beckwith Street North should continue to be encouraged more broadly within the study area. The provision of safe, easy-to-use bike racks and lockers near popular destinations could further support active transportation and help reduce any strain on the transportation management system. Zoning standards that require new developments to provide bicycle parking should be further considered in the town's pending comprehensive zoning bylaw review. Next slide. In terms of shared parking standards, a shared parking formula is typically included in a zoning bylaw to calculate the required parking for a mixed-use development. They should be developed as part of the town's upcoming comprehensive zoning bylaw review. The standards we noted in our report, which are, there's 3 different communities we looked at. Either of them or one of them could be used as a baseline for consideration, and further supported by the town's future public consultations with residents and other stakeholders as a review of the uses within the town, and basically the percentage of use they would take up would have to be kind of looked at individually for specific users within the core of Smith Falls. Next slide. In terms of cash in lieu of parking strategies, the town should continue to offer cash in lieu of parking, but that the fee associated with each space be reviewed in terms of the intended use for these funds. The study identifies 2 such intended uses and cost development strategies. One option would be the funds could be utilized for the development of a new municipal parking lot. And the second option would be the funds could be utilized for maintenance of existing meters or upgrading meters. The town should update the zoning bylaw to also clearly identify that patio areas are not included within the reference to an eating area in the zoning bylaw, which can trigger the additional or requirement for additional parking spaces. The cash in lieu bylaw could also be updated to allow for up to 15% of a restaurant's existing parking lot spaces to be utilized for the establishment of a seasonal patio at a reduced cash in lieu of parkland rate, or of parking rate, sorry. Next slide. Paid parking in the downtown core. The town could continue to maintain parking rates and the 2-hour time limit for parking along the 2 most utilized streets, Beckwith and Main Street, in the downtown core. The municipalities that do provide 2-hour free time limits utilize other revenue tools such as higher enforcement fines and charges such as cash in lieu to cover the revenue losses associated with no parking rates. The town maintain the parking time constraints and eliminate paid parking on all remaining signed streets. And this would encourage users to park further away from these streets that are perceived to have parking congestion, and distribute parking a little bit wider out throughout the core. As part of this, the introduction of stronger enforcement and fines to encourage parking further out and to facilitate customer turnover to maximize the current supply of parking. Next slide. As part of our recommendation to possibly maintain paid parking on the 2 major streets within the core, the town should replace the existing meters with multi-space meters. They could be installed at a greater distance to serve a number of cars at a time. The town would have to evaluate its options, operational costs, the different technologies out there from the different manufacturers. And that would be undertaken through a detailed RFP or RFQ process to determine the best service provider based on your needs. In terms of replacement of existing meters, the study recommends phasing this upgrade as future roadworks are considered. For example, Beckwith Street, if you were to put something like these multi-space meters along Beckwith Street, you'd be looking at 9 to 10 meters. Main Street would be approximately 13 to 15 meters. Next slide. And the final recommendation we had was ongoing monitoring. Many surface parking lots which contribute to the current parking supply, there are right now. If any of them are developed, there would be a need to re-examine parking demand within the downtown core. Future development applications for large-scale development and or the redevelopment of underutilized lots in the study area could also trigger this. Such developments could be encouraged to accommodate parking demands on site or incorporate shared parking arrangements as well. A framework for monitoring parking should also be established. Parking surveys of the study areas should be done on a semi-regular basis or a less formal targeted basis. Establishing a target that would trigger considerations for adding to the regular parking supply, such as a practical capacity ratio of 85%, could provide an easily measurable threshold in this regard. And that is essentially an overview of the lengthy report that you were supplied. I guess at this time, I just would like to know if there's any questions or anything up specifically for discussion on the report and the presentation.
Yes, thank you. Councillor McKenna?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Caitlin, for the presentation. I'm just going to ask one clarification and one question. I'll limit it to two, and if there's time after everybody else, I do have some more. One is the clarification. It may be a typo, so I'm a little confused. You refer a couple of times, you did it on the slide and on page 56, referring to Beckwith and Chambers, and I think each time it should be Beckwith and Maine, if I'm not mistaken. Yes,
you are correct. That was an error on my part.
Okay.
Unfortunately, because there was a perception of, during our stakeholder meetings of Chambers and Beckwith. Unfortunately, it made a report a little bit confused there for a minute, but yes, that needs to be clarified a little bit better. It should say Beckwith and Maine.
Thank you. And my second question then is, on the demarcated parking, because you're right, I've seen it in many communities now where they're not putting the lines in. Are you aware of any evidence or research done after that happens? How do people behave? How efficient is that? It seems to be popular, but does it actually work?
So I can't speak to anything specifically, but I haven't come across any of the municipalities, especially the ones we looked at, that had any issues implementing demarcated parking spaces. Sometimes it can be an adjustment period for people who are not used to determining how far apart to park in terms of their own vehicles' limitations and movements. But generally, there's no issues that arise because of them. In terms of the number of, for example, the efficiency of them, the number of spaces you get out of that changes hour by hour depending on the size of vehicles you have in there and the, I guess, the comfortability of people to park close enough together. But there's nothing specific in terms of issues that we've ever come across.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, after, if there is another opportunity, I do have more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McGuire.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much, Caitlin. I really appreciated the recommendations on accessible parking and how we can incorporate that into our zoning bylaws and into our downtown projects. So that was really well thought out. I'm wondering with in the report it references accident statistics, and I'm wondering if you had a chance to review accident statistics and if they had any interesting information in them.
Right. So we were not provided any accident statistics from the police on that matter. So we didn't have anything to add to the report with respect to any accident statistics.
Okay, thanks. And like Peter, I'll ask one more question, and then if there's time, I'll maybe ask another one. But for on-street residential parking permits and the shared parking standards, is that something where, as these shared parking standards are developed, there's an opportunity to create on-street residential parking permit programs, or is that outside the scope of a shared parking standard?
So in terms of shared parking, that is, it's designed to be utilized privately. So shared parking between users on private property. When you're looking at doing a permitting system for residential users for on-street parking, that'd be a separate mechanism. In our report, we did note that as there isn't currently a lack of parking space within the downtown based on the data. There isn't the need at this time to develop that. But if there was, or if there is a ongoing concern about existing residential users within the downtown core parking on the street, there is potential to do a permitting system. Our recommendation in the report, or a note in the report, is it most likely be more beneficial to locate permitted residential users to parking lots, just because it can become a little bit tricky in terms of, especially operational perspective in the winter months. When you have permitted parking, permitted parking is if you do it to streets, you're locating them along one street, and then you have residents of that street who get somewhat concerned because their street is being utilized for all these additional residential parking spaces. And then when it comes to maintenance during the winter, snow clearing and whatnot, it can become a little bit difficult to organize people to move during the appropriate times for snow clearing to be dealt with. It is possible. They do it. It becomes a little bit more of a logistical exercise for the town if they were to go that route.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Any other questions? Councillor Dwyer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks, Katie, for the report. It was probably our most thorough parking analysis ever undertaken in town. So I'm sure it'll be put to good use as we start to make recommendations for changes. My first question actually had to do with residential parking. So thank you, Councillor McGuire, because Katie just answered that one. Katie, in your analysis, particularly your case study analysis, did you find anything related to the provision of green parking downtown, or more specific electrical vehicle parking, and how small towns are starting to prioritize that type of parking in their communities?
Unfortunately, none of the smaller communities are really getting on that bandwagon just yet. The only places we've come across it are in the larger urban centers that are really trying to encourage people to use other modes of transportation, whether it be public transportation, cycling, that sort of thing. But it's mainly because they have a lack of parking in those areas. None of the smaller communities that we came across really had anything that they were releasing data on yet. Most of them were initiated through private parking areas.
Okay, thank you. And then I just have one further question. I've always found that the struggle in small towns is that from a planning perspective, you want to try and discourage vehicles, but at the same time, you have this acknowledgement that everyone has to rely on a vehicle to get to where they need to be. When you reviewed our current zoning bylaw, did you generally find that our parking requirements are high compared to some of our comparable case studies, particularly for those commercial uses? Or would you say that we are generally consistent with other kind of urban rural communities in the area?
So based on our analysis, the parking rates for commercial business, that sort of thing within the core, is completely consistent with other municipalities of similar sizes.
Okay. No, that's fine. And I'm sure, I mean, as Carl does the kind of comprehensive review of our zoning bylaw, that perhaps there's an opportunity to look at that. But I mean, I think the options that you've given for kind of doing a combined analysis might be something that, you know, long term we could look at expanding to our downtown street parking as well. You know, if you treat the entire boundary of the downtown as one cohesive area, just like you would like a shopping mall parking lot, then there might be a little bit of wiggle room to kind of adjust those rates so that we're prioritizing other pieces of infrastructure, but also, you know, perhaps there's a bit of a net gain there that we could transfer to long-term parking for our residential units. Because I know, having spoken to property owners downtown, particularly as they start to renovate their upper stories, there's always a keen interest to kind of elevate the type of tenant that's in there, particularly by upsizing the size of the units. But I mean, if anytime that you're getting, you know, a family in a unit like that, you're going to need direct on-site parking or at least reliable parking that's close. And that's kind of always been our challenge downtown, is that, you know, if you want to try and create a diversity of housing stock, you need to actually be able to provide those additional service needs on the street or in close proximity, and we just haven't been able to do that yet. So thanks for the information. I think that's all of my questions for now, and
Okay,
I think we're going to talk about where we go from here after this.
Mayor Panko?
Thank you. Thanks, Caitlin. This is very informative. Just wondering, when it comes to the paper parking models and the opportunities here, I mean, looking at them, they're not something, ideally we wouldn't have them on a street. They're a bit of a drawback from sight lines and doesn't really fit what we'd like to see, especially on Beckwith Street. But when you talk about the need for 13 to 15 on Main, is there any cost benefit analysis to suggest, like, it probably doesn't make sense, as an example, to put them at the further reaches of a parking area, where if you look at the volume of parking spots occupied at any given time, those are the areas probably that have less parking, and less parking up there probably means maybe less enforcement up there and less justification for putting a few $8,000 to $12,000 units at the further reaches. So I like the concept of reducing or eliminating the cost of parking, maybe in the further reach, further out from the downtown core, and maybe charge a little bit more in close. But is there any analysis on that basis?
So there's nothing specifically in our report to talk about, I guess, the further reaches of Beckwith Street, because we were trying to, although we do bring Beckwith Street into it, the focus of the report was the majority of the rest of the downtown core. But it does make sense from a user perspective that if you're not finding the users going that far up Beckwith Street because the businesses to support those users aren't there, that you wouldn't necessarily have meters along there. Again, that also could be part of a more detailed RFP process to develop costing of them, spacing of them, the different recommendations of where they're most beneficial to the specific blocks that would benefit from them. Because you would also, if you have a few blocks up that don't have meters, you'd have more people parking further up, which would encourage more walking to businesses.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that would be a little bit more of a detailed analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Alford?
Not really a question. There is a great deal in this report. It's very thorough, and there were some aha moments in it when I was reading it. I feel very. I'm grateful to have this parking study because it takes out some of the perceptions and anecdotal evidence that people offer. So I'm glad that we're going to have this to go forward with. So thank you, Caitlin.
Councillor Brennan, did you have your hand up or are you just moving?
No, I did. Thanks, Caitlin. This is much needed and well received. And I really appreciate all the work that you guys done. And the one point is the paid parking in the downtown core. And I'm very interested. I'm looking forward to us discussing how that's going to go forward. In my mind, and I'll save that for a committee of the whole meeting, but the Beckwith Street line maybe should be a 2-hour, and then we could talk about the side streets. The other question I had was about the shared parking spaces. You mentioned 3 other communities that you looked at. What were those 3? And can you just expand on that a bit?
Okay, let me just open that section of my report. So I'm, parking. Okay. So what we had looked at was 3 communities that actually implemented shared parking. One was Newmarket, Pickering, and Burlington. So we couldn't find anything that was a little bit smaller necessarily as a comparable source, but they were just 3 who implemented a strategy, and all their strategies were fairly similar. What they did was they list specific uses and then broken down those specific uses by a time period, like a peak time period, morning, noon, afternoon, evening. Some of them only did morning, afternoon, evening, not as detailed, and then evening and weekends. So the town could utilize a similar, I guess, percent of or ratio of use for each of those time periods. But that's something that's probably better to be developed a little bit further, specifically to Smith Falls. So you'd want to look at, okay, what are the actual users within the core, and what is generally their peak periods, and an estimation of the rate of users within those peak periods.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of that is a lot of the users are the actual business owners. So, which, you know, it's always been a complaint, not a problem. And,
right.
And so
in this case, it would be the shared parking strategy would be for parking lots, private parking lots versus on street.
Okay.
So you could take into account the users being the employees or the business owners themselves as part of that percentage. And it would just create a higher percentage of rate during those specific periods.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Katie.
Okay, Councillor McKenna, back to you for your third question.
Thank you. And Councillor McGuire brought up downtown housing rental units. And it's the context, the study is, you did everything within the scope of the study, and I appreciate that. The context that's missing for me, and maybe Mr. Grenke or town staff have this already, but is there a place where we know what is the inventory of downtown apartments in that study geography, and how many, and do we know the inventory of parking for private parking available for those number of apartments? Is that something we've ever collected? Because to have that piece of information alongside this may help future decisions for me. I'm not sure how important it is, but I don't know. I have run into people who are looking for parking who live in the apartments in the winter. In the summer, they're fine. They use the street, but they can't find private parking in the winter. So not knowing what the demand is or what the inventory is that, have we collected that before? And I just wonder how difficult it would be to find it.
Say, Morris, did you want to comment?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So back in 2018, when we launched the utilization study, we took an inventory of publicly available spaces, whether they were private parking, off-street private parking, or on-street and off-street public parking. We did not look at private parking for private purposes. So we don't have a handle on that. Your second part of that question about the number of units, perhaps I'll pass that over to Mr. Grenke.
I can't see him. Senior Planner Grenke, do you want to answer that?
It can wait. It can wait to.
It can wait. Yeah, we can talk about it when he does his presentation.
Thank you,
Councillor McGuire. You had another question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is also on the cost benefit of the paid parking. I don't quite understand the business plan behind it from the report. I know the report indicates that it helps with turnover and it's the status quo, but I don't understand other municipalities, the challenges that they have that would make it more appealing to go that way than the other way. It sounds like one way you're bringing in the money based on revenues, the other way maybe it's more enforcement-based revenues. But why would eliminating paid parking for 2-hour parking lead to, as said in the report, less customer turnover, use among merchants, employees, and tenants of residential units?
So it wouldn't necessarily lead to that. What we were trying to do when proposing a strategy of maintaining paid parking on the 2 streets that are busiest is more to combat the perception of parking issues. Those are the 2 streets that were identified the most of with the heaviest amount of business and people wanting to park as close to the businesses as possible. Paid parking really just encourages people to park further away more so. It also with paid parking, you still can have the same thing you have with just with enforced parking. You can have someone paying the meter all day, every day, and not moving within the required time frame. It really just comes down to a simple review of what makes sense at the time for the town. A lot of these municipalities understood that maintaining paid parking within the downtown core could potentially encourage further turnover, but none of these municipalities have any data to support either scenario. They just felt that, okay, at the time, we're going to remove parking as part of an upgrade of a major street, and we'll see how it goes. But unfortunately, a lot of these municipalities don't collect that data, so we don't have any good analysis of one benefit over the other. The town could move forward with removing all paid parking within the core. There is a, I guess, a option, or not really an option, but a possibility that could create more people, at least without the enforcement tool, just parking for as long as they want to and clogging up in front of some businesses. That may be an issue, may not be an issue. But what we've come across is trying to find a good balance of trying to solve an issue or a perceived issue on those main streets while encouraging users to disperse with their parking habits a little bit further out in the core.
Great. I think for me, it's great to understand it's not a firm recommendation where, you shall, it's more of a you could.
Yep.
And I think I really like the recommendation in the report that says every 2 years we should be taking another look at this and looking at the data, collecting more data to know how things are evolving over time as things pick up. My second question is on the residential spaces. Orangeville's got 1 space per unit, according to the table. We've got 1.25, and the other 2 municipalities studied have 1.5. I'm wondering if you have any recommendation on the advantage of the 1 space per unit in Orangeville versus the 1.5 in the other communities, and what might work best in Smith Falls.
Right. So what is the kind of the key crux of that is you have a 1-bedroom apartment and you're essentially making them provide 2 spaces because you round up. There is some analysis can be done that if you do have it can be an incremental change in the number of parking. So if you have a 1-bedroom, maybe it should be reduced to 1. And if you have a 2-bedroom, then you look at either going 2 or 3 spaces. It really comes down to tenant versus visitor space. If the town is not concerned with necessarily an overflow of tenant visitors in the downtown core, it's more just the tenants themselves, then a 1-for-1 ratio on bedrooms would make more sense.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. We appreciate your report, and I know we're going to be using it, as Councillor Brennan said, as we move forward, and we're going to have meetings, a committee of the whole meetings on a lot of these issues. For me, what I thought was most impressive, and I'm looking forward to us being able to do, is the accessibility aspects of your plan. Right now, it's not a very accessible downtown, and I know that the merchants and businesses down there are still struggling with how they are going to get people into their business as well as just off the street. But thank you very much for your presentation. I just see Mayor Panko has his finger up just a minute.
Sure.
Mayor Panko?
Yeah, one final question. Just Kate, I'm intrigued by the mobile pay option.
Yes.
Obviously, there's less infrastructure, less overhead to get this started, maybe a little bit less convenient, but as they're moving to the future, virtually everybody has a smartphone. Two questions. One, any examples where this is working and working well? And secondly, is there anyone that provides maybe a permitting system where you can get a permit if you don't have the ability to pay by phone?
So are you talking about systems that solely utilize phone?
Yes.
So we haven't come across any in Ontario that have done it yet. None of the ones we looked at had done it solely. They all provided a pay and display with cash or credit card or the phone option. I haven't come across any that just did them on their own. But sorry, what was the second half of your question there?
Well, I guess as an example, we implemented that. There's obviously overhead to get started, but any example of having a mobile system and simply a permit system for anybody who you would permit if you haven't got a phone to get.
Right. I haven't come across a permitted parking. In addition, most of them really just deal with, I guess, the free parking associated with the accessibility permits. But I haven't come across any that actually had dealt with a permitting system. But it is a very interesting concept to pay for, I guess, a monthly or bi-monthly or process if you're always in the downtown system. I guess the strategies with that would be when then would they just be enforced if they were in a paid parking space and they were not being counted by a paid meter? Would it be harder for enforcement to determine how long they had been there if they're still meeting within the time frames? Because I would assume through that system they would still have the time limit associated with that space. That is definitely an interesting concept.
Great, thank you.
Okay, seeing no more questions. Thank you again, Caitlin. It was a pleasure having you this afternoon.
Well, thanks for having me.
Okay, moving on. There are no adoption of minutes this afternoon, and there are 4 reports. So I'm going to start with CAO Morris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So perhaps we'll turn it over to Deputy Clerk Bennett. She's going to provide a brief update on the Emergency Control Group as Chief Cheeseborough is away this week. Nadine, you're on mute.
Sorry, I thought I had it off. I apologize for that. I'm just going to provide a quick update. The Emergency Control Group continues to meet every week. Typically, we meet on Thursday. However, with the announcement from Premier Ford today, our Emergency Control Group will be meeting tomorrow. So we're hoping to have some messaging out following that meeting. Since Chief Cheeseborough provided council with an update last week, we have seen an increase in some of the cases. So I'll just go over those statistics quickly. In Ontario, we have 36,839 cases, 32,663 have recovered, and there have been 2,722 deaths. The Canadian statistics are 108,000. Cases, 71,648 have recovered, 8,787 deaths. And then in Lennox, Leeds, and Grenville, I just checked their website before the meeting, and their stats are still the same at 354 cases, 300 have recovered, and there have been 52 deaths. So that is just a slight increase from the numbers presented last week. As council is aware, the 4 area health units announced a collaborative mandatory mask instruction, and our Smiths Falls Police have reported that that everyone's been complying with that and using the masks. Just a reminder to everyone that the face shields do not replace the mask. They can be used by those that have health issues, but they do not provide the same protection. So we need to be aware of that. The town buildings continue to be closed at this point, and a return to work protocol and policy is being established. Staff have ordered sanitizer dispensaries for the town facilities. And the provincial state of emergency is still being extended to the date of July 24th, 2020. So I think everyone's probably heard that the Premier did make an announcement today at 1 o'clock. And just to go over that quickly, what he announced is 24 regions in Ontario, which is the vast majority, will enter stage 3 on Friday, July 17th at 12:01 a.m. And the Toronto area is still going to remain closed. They didn't enter stage 2 until later, so they have to remain closed at this point in time in stage 2 to reduce the numbers and to see how it goes there. Stage 3 that the Premier has announced for Friday will allow 100 people to attend an outside event, 50 people to attend an indoor event, and at all times it is requested that they continue to practice physical distancing, especially with members outside of their social circle. The following businesses may open in stage 3, as announced by the Premier today: dine-in bars and restaurants, gyms and fitness centers, most personal care services, live shows, movie theaters, casinos, recreation facilities and activities, team sports and live sporting events, tour and guide services. It was stressed today in the Premier's announcement, and I know our local medical officer of health continues to stress that we need to continue to stop the spread of COVID-19 by practicing physical distancing, wearing our mask or face coverings, and to practice good hand hygiene. These measures are critical as we safely enjoy the loosening of these restrictions. And they also announced today that the medical experts will continue to monitor the numbers and diligently monitor spikes in COVID-19 cases. Minister Lecce also announced that on July 27th, all daycare centers can operate and increase cohorts of 15 children with continued strict health and safety requirements in place, which will allow working parents to return to work safely and know that their children are being cared for safely. Minister Lecce also noted that health and experts are working together with his staff to prepare for the fall, and that he will return soon, respecting back to school measures. It's something that is heavily on most parents' minds, and he said that they will be back, and he is aware that everyone is thinking of that. So as noted, our emergency control group will meet tomorrow, and then following that, we will get any messaging out respecting the town of Smiths Falls as we all work together to keep our community safe. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I think now we have Director Dunlop.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just 2 updates from Public Works this evening. Number 1, I just wanted to mention that we've been communicating with the town of Carleton Place regarding the household hazardous waste program. As council may or may not be aware, that program has been delayed in its opening this year, much in part with the complexities of operating that site. And in particular, the high volumes of traffic in that very constrained location on Patter Street in Carleton Place. Communications we received from Carleton Place are pointing to a probable opening of that facility in early August. So we're hoping to get a mass communication out to our residents around that. And again, just for council's interest, that program is also supports other municipalities, including Beckwith, Mississippi Mills, Montague, Drummond North Elmsley, and Perth as well. So we're all kind of in the same situation right now. Second update this evening is of course Beckwith Street, just building on the communications from last week. Our servicing is advancing. Much of the focus right now is on the west side of the street. The crews are at Royal LePage and doing installations heading down the block. You will also see those large circular chambers starting to get pulled out on the east side of the street between Russell and Main, as each of those properties have their final hookups with the plumbers. So things are advancing. We have some night water main activities going on. Tonight we have a crew tying in the water main at the north limit of the site on Beckwith Street. So essentially the main that heads up towards Tim Hortons, as an example, will be tied in. And again, that crew will be back doing night work again on Wednesday, doing another water main connection on William Street East. All in all, we have, I think, almost 10 water main connections we have to do, and this will put us up to about 6. So other works that are advancing this week, the road excavation is largely done. And when I say that, that's building the coarse granular base for the roadway. There's a few areas that they will touch up after the waterworks are done. You will see electrical installations going on the block between Main Street and West on essentially the west side of the street. So that's building those shallow electrical trenches that will help supply power and operate our street lights and our traffic signals and our ornamental lights. Financially, another significant month for June. We are going through those financials right now, and expenditures for June were $778,000. Our financial expenditures on the project to date end of June are $3.94 million. So financially, we are about 56% complete when you compare it with the contract cost. The extra works that have been authorized stand at $71,989, and that's trending at just a shade over 1% contingency use. So again, very, very lucky to be in this position, especially when we almost have the underground behind us. And we're expecting to have final tallies on the water and the storm and the sanitary at the end of this month. So we'll know where each of those budget areas sit individually, and we'll be reporting those back to council as well. So things are going well.
Any questions for Director Dunlop? No. Thank you very much, Director Dunlop, for that update.
Thank you.
Now I think we're going to talk to Director Manhire.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to go without video today because I'm got rural internet and it's not working very well.
That's okay.
So I have several updates, and one is that we do have an expression of interest out for the structures at 54 Lombard in terms of being able to move those structures off site for future use of that intersection. To date, we have received no requests for information. We do have a DSS that we could share with people, but that closes on Thursday, so I will report next week on the progress for that. We also have a tender out for the basketball courts at Lower Reach, which has another week to address. We've added, the Parks and Rec Department has added a number of picnic tables to the spaces that are available for the picnic lunches, which has been received very well by residents, as well as serving the restaurants well. And there are more and more people coming on to that service, so you can have your lunch down along the canal at any point. Town Hall, the project is in its final phases. We have some plumbing features and some millwork that is going in. This week, people will see the outside landscaping of the Town Hall, hopefully completed by the end of this week, if not the beginning of next week. So that will be a visible change there. In terms of some of the things that we've already talked about, our childcare at St. Francis is at 31. We still have some capacity, but we're bringing staff that have been off back on and training them to deliver on the new protocols. The announcement today does change things, so we will be circling back with the county and the province to try to determine what that means. But essentially, we're at about 30%, or we're able to fill about 30% of our capacity before. We will now be able to fill 90% of our capacity. So it opens up a significant amount of space for childcare opportunities. We did open up, we reached out to, as part of a request from council last week, we did reach out to partners in the community, and we're able to open up a cooling station with the help of the Legion and some of their members. We opened it up for 2 days last week. Once we got the criteria settled from public health, as well as got volunteers set up to go. We also, the town provided hand sanitizer and water and set up amenities, and we were able to open that the last 2 days. We also got criteria from public health in terms of when they declare a heat warning or heat emergency. And a heat warning, just as a reference piece, is when we have 2 days of sustained temperatures over 31 degrees during the day, and it does not go below plus 20 at night. So if it's above 20 at night and over 31, or a humidex of 40 degrees for 2 days, is when they declare that heat emergency. So that's when we will be looking at opening that cooling center. It does look like, if the forecast is at all accurate, that we should be okay for the next couple of weeks. I believe we had 3 participants at the cooling station. One thing that I did want to mention as well was that I wanted to thank community members who, knowing that the cooling station was open, brought water and food for people that needed to access it. So it's a wonderful piece that to see the community kind of stepping forward and helping out with that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. Councillor McKenna.
Thank you, Director Maynard. I want to just say how beautiful the facade looks in front of the municipal complex. That glass is amazing. And it was also really warmed me up to see that it was Healy's Glass, a wonderful local business doing all that work. So it's going to be an amazing facade. It's going to be terrific. And we've got to use some local business. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Councillor Brennan, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I did. Thank you, Director Manhire, for that. And I agree that town hall is going to look great. On the cooling station, given the uptake was very, very sparse, I mean, 3 people over a couple of days in the hottest days of the year, is there a possibility of using the lobby at the arena for that purpose, and then freeing up the people at the Legion from having to be there and spend their day there? I'm sure they would volunteer there, but is that a possibility?
Through the chair, absolutely. We looked at a number of different locations and felt that a location in the downtown area was going to be more accessible to people that wanted to access it. So that was one of the reasons why we reached out to the Legion to be able to do that. But certainly we can look at it. The other thing was that public health, as I'm sure council and the community can appreciate, has their hands full with dealing with COVID. But they are willing to put out notices as well around impending heat alerts.
Yeah.
So that will give us a little bit of time to not only plan, but also let the community know that that service is available to them if they need it.
Yeah, it was last minute, I know. And, you know, when you ask the Legion to do something, they're not going to say no.
We really appreciate their efforts. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Councillor McGuire.
Thank you, Director Manhire. Lots of good news coming from community services this week. I'm wondering about, now that we're up to 90% capacity for the childcare services, are all the staff returned to work now?
Madam Chair, we have 5 staff that are still not returned. Some of them by choice, some of them because they actually can't get care, and some because they haven't been trained at this point. So we are working on that, and we're trying to balance the return to work with our demand for childcare. And this announcement from the province, where it still has to be unpacked, appears to kind of give us that entry point.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Director Manhire. I would just add that I've been watching with great joy the hose tower being restored, refurbished beautifully, and looking forward to it being finished. Thank you for all your work. Thank you very much for your report. And I think CEO Morris wanted to give a report. Is that correct?
Yes, just one, Madam Chair. Committee members may recall back in early January, you authorized staff to submit a grant application for the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program, called the shortened version is ISIP. We did that, and we just unfortunately got news that we did not make the cut. The process is that we applied to the province then nominates to the federal government, and then they choose projects to fund. So all is not lost. We understand there is another intake, likely this autumn, so we will apply once again, of course. One would also hope that with the economic recovery efforts underway, there will be more infrastructure spending, stimulus funding. So we're hopeful that there will be other opportunities out there. But the fact is, this one was a grant of about just north of $2 million between both levels of government. So we won't see that on this round. Interestingly, I did reach out to our colleagues across Eastern Ontario through the Mayor's Caucus, and 10% of communities that applied were nominated to the federal government. So we're not alone, and we will be working as a group to understand what they're looking for specifically, so we can tailor our applications perhaps on the next round. So not good news, but we fully expect there will be other opportunities, and we'll keep you informed. Thank you.
Mr. McGuire has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. CEO Morris, what was that project for? Maybe I cut out there, but that application.
Yes, thank you for the question. It was for the elevated water storage project.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on, we have only one correspondence item. Oh, sorry, Councillor Brennan, go ahead.
That's okay. That was actually, Councillor McGuire asked my question, but the other part of that was I noticed this week that the village of Pakenham received a nice grant for a bridge. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking about a bridge called the Confederation Bridge. Is that on the radar for a grant application?
Go ahead.
Well, in fact, on next week's agenda, you'll be receiving a report about Confederation Bridge. So just as a reminder for committee, the last time it came forward, 4 options were presented. So it will be important to make a decision on which option you wish to go with before we apply for funding. So next week's report will move us one step closer to enable you to make that decision.
Thank you. As I started to say, there was only one correspondence item this evening, and that's a letter from Minister Steve Clark, Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. It outlines the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Act 2020 to help Ontario get back on track. It was signed on July 8th. It's critical to ensure communities across Ontario receive urgent financial support they need. the bill is going, some of the proposals in it are local boards are going to be able to perhaps meet electronically on a permanent basis, proxy voting, make it faster for the harmonize the building code. Just to name a few, the ministry will be hosting technical information briefing on the proposed community benefits and framework coming up. If you're interested, they have a webpage, ontario.ca/alert. There are no in-camera issues this afternoon, and so we'll move on to priority issues, and we'll start with 8A, which is Senior Planner. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll keep this brief. Firstly, I'd like to express my appreciation to Katie Morfitt and her team for the work that they've done on the parking study here. So it's certainly a very broad amount of work here, covering several operational disciplines within the town, and the key thing is going to be the next steps here. So looking at the details of implementation. So that would include the parking RFQ for the parking meters, the infrastructure, depending on how council would like to proceed, looking at a number of pieces in zoning. So certainly we've heard that our parking the parking provisions for commercial uses aren't too far beyond, or they're very close to comparable to what other municipalities have. We have slightly larger parking space dimensions, but certainly we'll be looking at that. And also the shared parking provisions is something I'm really interested in. I think there's definitely something to work with there, and ultimately what that can do is save some space downtown, and I think that would be very helpful. So we'll certainly want to get that right when we do that, as well as the cash in lieu of parking and updates to the parking bylaw. So lots of things for council to consider as we move forward, and we'll seek council's direction on how to proceed with the report that was presented. And to respond to Councillor McKenna's inquiry from the presentation, I don't have a housing inventory in my hands for the downtown core. However, I can reach out to my colleagues in the housing task force. I know the housing task force is looking at zoning and also looking at the parking space provisions as well. As Katie identified, it's that same 1.25 parking spaces is required, whether it's a bachelor or whether it's a 4-bedroom. So these are the sorts of things that we'll be looking at in order to maximize the use of the resource. So I think I'll pause now, and we'll seek council's direction, and Katie and Tim Chatter from Jail Richards remain here to respond to inquiries as well, and I may direct questions there as well. Thank you.
Councillor Dwyer.
Thanks. Sorry, I have to abandon my headphones, so hopefully you can hear me okay. I have no problem receiving the report for information. I think it's full of good anecdotal information from the public consultation, which is always nice to be able to actually formalize into something that's a little bit more substantive. But I really like the methodology that Katie used. And I think the recommendations at this point, like Councillor McGuire said, are loose enough that by receiving the report, we're not really tying our hands in the future. I look forward to debating a lot of the components of the recommendations as they come forward. I mean, that's not our purpose tonight. So with that, I mean, I'm all in favor of receiving it for information. Thanks.
I think Councillor McKenna was the next hand up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Gregke, as we consider this going forward, I'll ask you to help me and maybe my colleagues around the decision-making process, and to think about presenting it to me anyways, in a way that some of these recommendations might cascade on others. So what would be the first thing we should consider? Because then that may lay a path for going forward for the others that follow. I haven't had time to think about it that way, but if you get what I'm saying, there's some things we may need to do first, and then that will inform the next and the next. I don't know if we can bundle them into one decision-making process. We might need to take them in chunks. And if you, when you're thinking about coming back 4 decisions could lay it out, that would be very helpful for me. Thank you.
Did you want to speak to that, Carl?
Sure, I'll defer to a CAO Morris. I saw that
Okay,
it is
yeah.
hand up as well.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think one of the early decisions that council needs to consider is, do you want paid parking in the downtown or not? Mm-hmm. And there are 2 factors motivating that decision. One is how we want to view parking from a revenue neutrality perspective. So what I mean by that is do you want, from a policy perspective, for parking to pay for itself, or do you want it to be subsidized by the taxpayer? Historically, and financially, we've probably been paying for the enforcement costs, and our equipment costs have been very, very small. We have very old, outdated, redundant equipment. So we haven't, as a town, made investments in parking infrastructure in the past. So clearly, if council wishes to have paid parking in some or all of the downtown, that would be a decision we would need fairly soon. So there is lead time in terms of ordering the equipment and installing it and training and getting it to talk to our financial systems and all kinds of things. So that would be an early decision, I think. The other motivating factor is that through the Beckwith construction, we've removed the single space meters. We are not intending on returning them. Again, we simply can't get parts for them. They're no longer functional, if I can be frank. And they take up a lot of precious space in a downtown. I think we're all trying to make more pedestrian friendly. So right now, as you know, through the COVID period, you have removed parking fees. So we're not charging for parking right now. Presumably that will change at some point in the future. It would be ideal to coordinate the reintroduction of paid parking, if you want paid parking, with the introduction of a new metering system. It's probably a 3 to 4 month project from start to finish, from the point that you make a decision to go with pay and display, for instance, until we can train enforcement staff and put them in place. That would be an aggressive timetable. So if we were looking at reinstating parking fees in January, we would need a decision relatively soon on that. So I would submit that having a discussion about paid or not would be one of the first priorities.
There are a few more questions. Councillor Brennan next.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Councillor Dwyer. We received the report. I received the report late last week. The public hasn't called me about it. They called me about when's the street going to be done? What are you going to do with parking? But you know, I don't think this is a gun to our head. We have to talk about this tonight, and I'm not prepared to, frankly. And you know, it was a great report. It gives the options out. I've got some thoughts on it, but I want to talk to some people. Today's Monday. I think I got it Thursday or Friday, and I want to discuss and consult, and then we can have a fulsome discussion. The street is still ripped up, and it will be for some time. I don't know that this is urgent at all, but this is good information.
Thank you for that, Councillor McGuire. Did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I guess so. I was trying to clarify in my head whether we're commenting on recommendations. It sounds like we're receiving the report for information tonight. Like Councillor Brennan, I too have a hard time consulting between Thursday and Monday, so more time there is handy. But I guess the question for CAO Morris is, we've got a $100,000 2020 budget line item associated with paid parking on Beckwith Street. We've got a construction project that's ahead of schedule and ahead of budget. When do we need to have this conversation? And is this something in the next 2 weeks, 4 weeks? What kind of timeline to have the paid parking discussion?
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes.
Yeah, there's, if I led anyone to believe you need to make that decision tonight, my apologies. That was not my intention. I'm just saying that's one of the earlier decisions you need to make. So within the next month, if we're looking at potentially starting a new parking management system in January, for instance.
Go ahead.
So this is not, there's no aspect of this installation that needs to be completed underground. We can have the street completed and then install the parking meters to follow.
Yes, the ones, most are solar powered, so we don't need a hardwire connection to it.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Alfred, did you have your hand up?
I did, Madam Chair, thank you. Yeah, we are receiving it tonight. The one thing that struck me while I was reading it and listening also to Ms. Morfitt presentation and being the council member on the DBA, there doesn't seem to really be any hard and fast evidence that paid parking is any more or less efficient and cost effective than more enforcement. So when we're thinking about this, and there is a lot to unpack in that report, a great deal of it, but I didn't see any financial considerations that we're going to I'm sorry. Councillor Brennan, Councillor Dwyer is. Oh, okay. I didn't see any financial benefit for one scenario over the other.
Right.
So that makes this a little bit more difficult, in fact.
Right. Well, I think having time, it will be good for you to be able to talk to the DBA board and businesses too and get their perception, because I know in the past, before any of this was done, when I was sitting on the DBA board, there was a lot of fear that if we don't charge, people will abuse it. You know, there was that aspect that they'd park all day and nobody would be able to come to their business.
And so I would say, Madam Chair, that it's been little changed since I went. They are split too. You know, as so often, one has its advantages, and so does others. So this one's going to be, this one is going to be left to the best judgment, I think, of council, because there is no quantifiable in terms of financial.
Yeah. Councillor Brennan, are you waiting? Or
yeah, I agree. I totally agree with that. I mean, it's not an easy decision, and it's one that you have to take seriously. You have to consult. And I couldn't agree with more. Like, we need to talk to businesses, talk to people. And, you know, there's a lot of information in these reports. So, yeah, you know, we have to do the right thing.
Right. Senior Mars, did you want to end with something?
Yeah, just I think to respond to Councillor Alford. So Katie, in her report, identified that in those communities that don't have paid parking, they tend to have higher fine rates. And the reason for that is it's not only a deterrent, but it's a way to raise money to pay for parking so that the taxpayer isn't subsidizing it. So what I would leave you with is higher fines. If you rely on fine revenue to fund your parking system, in my view, that's not ideal, because fine revenue is inherently acrimonious. Nobody wants a $40 ticket. But we've conditioned people to pay 50 cents an hour. So I would just leave you with the thought that Smith Falls has rounded the corner in terms of the psychological impacts of parking. And when you rely on high fine revenue, that's when not only people get angry, but sometimes they stop coming to your community because they leave with a bad taste in their mouth. So I would just leave that thought with you. We'll come back with more information on the pros and cons of each.
Thank you for this. And no, I do think that we'll have time to consult with people and also give our own thought process time to figure out what side we're on and what we'd like to do as we move forward. Priority issue B is with our Treasurer Casil, and it's the award of RFP number 20-002, preparation of a development charges study bylaw.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as Council is aware, commissioning a development charge study is one of the initiatives within the town's 2019-2022 strategic plan, with a target completion date for the final quarter of 2020. To that end, I'm here this evening to provide Council with background on the RFP for the consulting services for that study and award the contract to the qualifying firm with the best overall proposal. The RFP was issued June 3rd with key deliverables including a DC background study shall meet all requirements of the Development Charges Act 1997 as amended, facilitate a public review and presentations of any recommended development charges options as required to committee and/or council, and preparation of a development charges study in accordance with requirements of the Development Charges Act. The RFP did indeed stipulate that all of these would be completed in line with the strategic plan's target date. As per the consultant's proposal, those timelines for the projects are indeed flexible and can be adjusted to reflect the town's needs. So I just want to bring that to your attention. And on June 30th, the RFP closed with 2 proposals. And just to note, there were 7 proposals picked up, but only 2 submitted. So once the review evaluation process was completed, the submission from Hempson Consulting Limited addressed all of the objectives and yielded the highest evaluation score and offered the best overall value to the town with the lowest bid. There was $30,000 budgeted for this project, which is funded for capital reserves. The projected budget from the consulting firm, along with advertising cost, is $28,640 or $640. The surplus of about $1,400. So if council concurs with staff's recommendation, the award of contract to Hempson's will come forward for approval at tonight's council meeting. So if you had any questions on that.
Councillor McKenna, do you have a comment or question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Janet, we've just received word from Minister Clark on the Economic Recovery Act 2020. There's a piece of legislation coming forward that, according to his letter, talks about changes to either development charges or community benefit charges. Is the contract flexible enough to adjust to that if as new information is coming forward at this time?
Absolutely, they addressed that in their proposal.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think it was Councillor Brennan. Did you have a comment?
No, just a question. I mean, yeah, I'll support this, and of course, but it's just so people that are watching, I know there's lots of people watching, know we haven't approved development charges. We're approving a study of development charges, and if Planner Grenke is still with us, maybe you could walk us through the process of the exercise we're going through here. You there, Carl?
Maybe it's not.
Or CO Mars.
So I can speak, Madam Chair.
Yes, go ahead. I can't see you, but go ahead.
Sorry, I just turned my video feed on. So as Councillor Brennan noted, at this point, we're not, Council's not being asked to commit to development charges. We're the exercise, and it's a very important exercise, and certainly I'll look for to CAO Morris or Treasurer Casil to step in as well and fill in any gaps. But at this point, we're just looking. The exercise we're taking would be identifying the works, the capital projects that we're anticipating to take over the next number of years, and identifying a value. The principle of development charges is that development pays for development and over the longer term, rather than the existing taxpayer. So that's a broad conversation that we would have to have before approving a development charges bylaw. But at this point, the exercise identifies the overall value and number that we could potentially, that the ceiling that we could be charging for residential, commercial, or industrial units, and there is a complex formula that needs to look into that. And as we know, that formula and some of the provincial rules around the Development Charges Act have amended over the last couple of years and over the last couple of days as well. So this is the first step in a very long process that will lead to an important decision for council months from now as to how do we want to proceed on that.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. And just further through the chair, there is a prescribed procedure municipalities must go through, and this is sort of the first step of that. And it's not going to be overnight, but it's a discussion that we're going to have in the community. So this is the first step, right?
I don't think he heard you.
That is correct.
That is correct.
Yeah. Yes. So Councillor Dwyer had a question, comment?
Thanks. I mean, it shouldn't be any surprise that I'm supporting this. I campaigned on DCs, and I know it might be a little premature to say, but I'm really looking forward to being able to plan and forecast for the cost of future DC updates and studies as part of this study. So we won't have to see this type of money come out of our normal operating budget in the future. I don't think you can go wrong with either Hempson or Watson. I mean, they're both reputable firms that do this type of work all over. So I have no problem going with the lowest bid on this. Janet, can you comment on how we are planning on handling the statutory public consultation around DCs? And do you think that there's adequate time to do that between now and November? Or is it kind of up in the air depending on what COVID does in the fall?
Exactly. They do comment in the proposal, and certainly will, whatever council and staff are comfortable with, if it starts to open up that we can have more one-on-one meetings, then we can do that, or we can do them virtually. So certainly that is not cast in stone. So
okay, perfect.
That as we go forward.
Okay, so beyond that, I have no concerns. I think the staff recommendation is great, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what Hempson brings forward at the end of the day.
Thank you. Councillor Alford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too have long advocated that we needed to study the DCs, because growth, DCs meaning development charges, meaning for those people who watch that growth pays for growth instead of it coming out of, and because we're experiencing this boom, this is exactly, in fact, I would have preferred if we had looked at this a year or 2 or 3 years ago. But we're finally getting around to it. So I am very supportive of Treasurer Koziel's recommendation, and can't wait to get started on this one.
Good. So don't leave us, Janet. You have the next priority issue, and that's award of RFP number 20 PW007, update to the town of Smiths Falls water and wastewater financial plan.
Okay, so just to provide a bit of background on this, the town of Smiths Falls currently holds a municipal drinking water license and drinking water works permit that are valid until July 15th, 2021. As part of that renewal process, the municipality must submit an application for renewal to the ministry no later than January 15th. And it has to be so 6 months prior to the license expiry date. And that renewal must include a submission of a water financial plan. So again, here this evening to provide background on the RFP that was issued for professional services to update the town's current water and wastewater rate study and the financial plan update. So it was issued June 3rd. Key deliverables included providing a financial plan meeting all requirements of Ontario Regulation 45307, along with the financial objectives of the town relating to the wastewater system. And again, through that, the development of an updated water and wastewater rate study that supports the objectives of the approved long-term financial plan. So on June 30th, the RFP closed with 3 proposals. There was 15 picked up originally. So once the review evaluation process was completed, again, Hempson Consulting addressed all of the objectives and yielded the highest score and the overall lowest bid. $30,000 was budgeted. It was split 50-50 from the water and the wastewater capital reserves. So the proposed budget through the consulting firm, and the ad is 28,793 for a surplus of about 1,200. So again, if council concurs with staff, we'll bring that forward this evening for approval.
I see a lot of thumbs up or hands up. Is there anyone who has question or concern? No? Councillor McKenna, did you have a question, or is that just your okay?
No, I did, Madam Chair.
Okay, go ahead.
To comment, I don't have a concern, and I want to do this. It's the last financial study, and it's unfortunate we have to update this. So because the municipality has not followed the original plan, we've not increased the rates as per the recommendation, and I'd be really disappointed to spend this money, hire the consultants, come up with a plan, and then either this council or future councils not follow the recommendations they adopted by users paying for the cost of a sustainable water and wastewater treatment plan. So if we're going to do this and we approve what the result is, I will challenge us and future councils to continue to actually follow through on what we've agreed to. It's like development charges. There's no sense of making a policy or a financial framework if we're not going to follow it. So I hope this is money well spent. I know we're required to, and I look forward to participating and seeing the end result.
Thank you for that. Councillor Brennan?
Yeah, I'm certainly going to support it because it's something we have to do. I mean, we've had this debate, and I want to thank Councillor McKenna for forwarding the report from AMO about, survey. And I would note in that report that the survey done, I believe it was by Watson's, with municipalities, that there's many municipalities, and I would include us in that, that say that, yes, we're moving towards that. However, to attain that goal, we're going to need help. We're going to need help in doing that. And that means help from the upper tier. So that's a discussion we'll have, and we will probably have it every year at budget time. We have it every year at budget time. And every year at budget time, the water rates increase. We're moving towards that. It's a question of how fast and how much assistance we're going to get. So yeah, we're going to have a look. And we had a Watson report a number of years ago before this term, and it was recommending somewhere in the neighborhood of 10% property tax increases. So, you've got to keep in mind the affordability for the people that live here. But yeah, obviously we have to do this, and the discussion of affordability on water rates and property taxes will be ongoing, as it always is.
Councillor Alford?
Yeah, I agree with both Councillor McKenna and to a degree Councillor Brennan, and that's why the discussion over development charges should be made easier by those things.
Right. Okay, thank you. So both those items, financial or Treasurer Castillo will come forward at the next meeting tonight.
That's correct.
So thank you for that. I need a motion to adjourn. Councillor Alford, seconded by Councillor McGuire. All in favor? 5 minutes enough? Okay, 5 minutes.
If you're ready, we're ready to roll. I'd like to welcome everyone to this special meeting of Smith Falls Town Council for Monday, July 15th. We have everyone in attendance this evening. I have no announcements myself tonight. I'll ask for disclosure of monetary interest. Hearing none, we have no delegations, we have no adoption of minutes. I will survey council for reports. Just show by hand, anyone got a report? Councilor McGuire.
Thank you, Your Worship. We had our Police Services Board meeting last Thursday. There's a lot of news coming out of it since we hadn't had a meeting since February, so we'll get lots to share over the next couple of weeks. But some of the highlights include we finally got the end of year 2019 budget, and just a reminder that it was 4.5% under, which translated in $216,269 being returned back to the town in surplus. The great news on the funding for the mental health nurse, that was renewed kind of at the 11th hour, and with COVID and everything, it was great to get an update on that. And I think it'd be well worthwhile to have a broader update at that at a future committee of the whole potentially. The business plan consultations are underway. The survey is being finalized. It's going to be distributed to community groups. If you're interested in participating in the survey, it's also going to be online. So the police service is working with economic development to make sure that we leverage social media and get that up. The 2019 annual report has also been completed. So that will be coming to a future committee of the whole meeting, and have good news that the first 7 hours of bike patrol have been completed as of the quarterly report that ended in June. A big thanks to Janice Tomlinson for the extra effort that went in. We met at the arena. I think it was a really great setup. We were spaced out, it was safe, but we got to have a face-to-face meeting, and I think it could potentially give us a model for how we could get back into meeting in person, especially if we could have quorum in a room during storms, then we're not so reliant on the technical difficulties. But I digress, and that's all I have for tonight. I don't know, Mayor Penko, if you want to add anything else.
No, I think it was great to get back and meet as a PSB, and you're right, the funding announcement for the mental health crisis scenarios is something that we had advocated for, and we recognize the value of this brought to our community. So it's very comforting, reassuring to know the province followed through with that. Any other reports? Okay, we have no bylaws this evening. We have a few motions. Our first is with Councillor Allen, please.
Yes, moved by myself and seconded by Councillor McGuire, award of RFP number 20 CORP 002, preparation of a development charges study and bylaw. That Council of the Corporation of the Town of Smith Falls award RFP number 20 CORP 002 to Hemson Consulting Limited for professional services relating to the preparation of a development charges study and bylaw. And further, that Council of the Corporation of the Town of Smith Falls authorize the Mayor and Clerk to execute the final contract with Hemson Consulting Limited for the amount of $31,471, HST included.
Thank you. Discussion, Councillor Allen, please.
Yes, one of our key priorities in our strategic plan, of course, is housing. And that category, we needed to commission a developmental study, developmental charges study and bylaw, which will encourage developers, we hope, to build accessibility, inclusivity, and community housing that is much needed. Hemson Consulting Limited won the RFP as they scored better than the other entry, and they came in at a lower bid.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Thank you. Moved by Councillor Allen, second by Councillor McGuire. Award of RFP number 20-CORP-002, preparation of a development charges study and bylaw. The Council of the Corporation of Town of Smith Falls award RFP number 20-CORP-002 to Hemson Consulting Limited for professional services relating to the preparation of a development charges study and bylaw. And further, the Council of the Corporation of Town of Smith Falls authorize the Mayor and Clerk to execute the final contract with Hemson Consulting Ltd for the amount of $31,471, HST included. All in favor? That's carried. Thank you. Councillor Dwyer, you're up next.
Thank you. Moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Brennan. that Council Corporation of the Town of Smiths Falls award RFP number 20-PW-007 to Hemsing Consulting Limited for professional services related to the update of the Town of Smiths Falls water and wastewater financial plan.
Very good discussion, Councillor Dwyer.
Thank you. We, as a safe drinking water provider, we are required by law to have a plan for managing our assets. We did pass a similar plan in 2016, but the plan that we're seeking assistance from Hemson in developing right now will be much more detailed and providing us with accountable management of our assets into the future. We did have quite a few recipients pick up our RFP submission, of which 3 submitted proposals. Hemson has similarly been awarded the contract for our DC studies, so it not only makes sense to twin those studies together and the work therein, but in this case, Hemson scored quite well and was the lowest bid.
Great, thank you. Any further discussion? Moved by Councillor Dwyer, seconded by Councillor Brennan, award of RFP number 20-PW-007, update to the Town of Smiths Falls Water and Wastewater Financial Plan. The Council of the Corporation of the Town of Smiths Falls award RFP number 20-PW-007 to Hemson Consulting Ltd. for professional services related to the update of the Town of Smiths Falls Water and Wastewater Financial Plan. All in favor? That's carried.
Mayor Pankow.
Oh, sorry, and further, Council of the Corporation of the Town of Smiths Falls authorize the mayor and clerk to execute the final contract with Hemson Consulting Ltd. with the amount of $31,640, HST included. Okay, again, all in favor? We're perfect. Thank you. Requires our announcements. Well, we have a little break from tradition. Councillor Allen, you go first.
No, it's no biggie. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
It's just the Railroad Museum of Eastern Ontario has an online auction. It's one of the things they're doing this year, just to help, pay the costs of the restoration that they're working on. So it's an interesting website, and there's all kinds of interesting things that you might go online and win. So I'm just telling people, please go in and check it out. That's all.
Wonderful. Thank you. Councillor Dwyer.
Thank you. Just one and a reminder to all of council, if you're interested, the AGM for real Wednesday. If you'd like details about participation, just feel free to send me an email and I can forward those on. I believe there was a request that you RSVP, but I'm sure it's not too late to join. I think we're having a virtual forum, and it will include the election of our new board. So that's very exciting. If anybody's interested, please feel free to attend. Otherwise, I'll have updates next week at council.
Thank you. Anything else? Councillor McKenna.
Thank you, Mayor. I wonder if my colleagues had looked at the AMO virtual conference, and I'm just wondering if any of you are thinking it would be a challenge, I think, to attend a conference like that virtually. However, I would love to think that one of us are thinking about it, or 2 of us dividing it up somehow. So I'm just encouraging you to go and look at it. There are some interesting speakers. I'm not sure how it will work sitting at all day at your desk watching it. It would be really tough, but maybe we could look at some way of, anyways, if anybody thought about it more than me, there is some good talks, but I'm not sure how to do it. So if any of you smart people have thought this through, let me know.
Councillor Brennan?
Yeah, it's a good thought. I guess to Deputy Clerk Bennett, are they charging the same amount for registration for the virtual conference?
I can check that tomorrow. To be honest with you, I haven't seen it, so I'll check.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councillor Alford.
Thank you, Your Worship. It's highly unlikely that my son is watching council. I don't know that he's ever put that on his watch list, but my son Bradley's birthday's today. So happy birthday, Bradley, from Mom.
Happy birthday, Bradley.
Happy birthday, Bradley.
Happy birthday.
Forever on YouTube, right? Okay, so a little break from tradition. As you're aware, Councillor Brennan has brought a Smith Falls trivia to our council meetings as we've been meeting virtually the last several months. Decided to pass the torch on, so I'm carrying that tonight. So this individual was born December 31st, almost a New Year's baby, 1955. Smith Falls native, obviously. Played in 4 hockey leagues: Ontario Hockey League, American Hockey League, National Hockey League, of course, and Central Hockey League. Best seasons were 19 goals and 22 assists twice, once with Buffalo, once with Pittsburgh Penguins. He is a member of the AHL record books, scoring the most shorthanded goals in an AHL season in its history in 1982-1983 with 11. Councillor Alford, I think you were the first one with your hand up. This individual is?
His name is escaping me. It's one of two. It's either Steve Hall or
Gary McAdam.
Gary McAdam.
Gary McAdam. Well done, Councillor Brennan. Yeah. Along.
Do you know his nickname?
No,
Pardon?
we don't need the nicknames here. Those
You probably can't say it on Zoom.
Okay.
Yeah, Gary McAdam played for. He was drafted in the 3rd round by the Buffalo Sabres. Played for Hershey for that year. Had 14 goals that year. 11 were shorthanded. Pretty remarkable. Played Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Detroit Red Wings, back to Pittsburgh, Calgary, back to the AHL, back to Buffalo, New Jersey. Finished on to Washington, and I think finished his career. Toronto. Yeah, with Toronto in 85-86. And of course, his poster hangs in our Memorial Community Center. Thank you, Councillor Brennan. So I get a chance to pick next week's victim, right? Okay, since Councillor Allen is looking away, I'm going to pick Councillor Allen. Okay, all yours.
I promise you it won't be sports.
Oh, come on. Okay. Motion for adjournment is with Councillor Brennan, please.
Thank you. Moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Dwyer, that this council adjourn its proceedings at 7:10 p.m. and stand so adjourned until the next duly called meeting of council.
Thank you. Moved by Councillor Brennan, second by Councillor Kennedy. Okay. Councillor Dwyer, this council adjourned proceedings at 7:10 and stand so adjourned the next duly called meeting of council. All in favor? We're adjourned. Have a good evening, everyone.
Yeah, have a